Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. So I'm Sach Mukherjee, and with my colleague Sylvia Richardson, I co-chair this lecture series, and it's really a tremendous pleasure and honor to welcome Max Welling from the University of Amsterdam and Microsoft Research. Welcome, Max, and thanks for being with us. I'll just say a few brief words of introduction and then hand over to you. So Max is a research chair at the University of Amsterdam and a distinguished scientist at Microsoft Research. So he's really I don't think there's any exaggeration to say he's a key figure in modern machine learning and AI, having made seminal contributions in many areas, including Bayesian learning, variational autoencoders, graph neural networks, and many other things. He earned his PhD, in fact, in physics, in theoretical high energy physics at Utrecht, working with Nobel laureate Gerard ter Hooft, and then moved into machine learning, eventually joining the faculty at UC Irvine before returning to Europe, to the Netherlands. And most recently, he's been working on general questions concerning invariances in machine learning models and on AI for science, which is what I think we'll hear about today. And in a way, Max, I think this connects back to your background in physics, so that's very interesting, I think. So of his many awards and activities, let me just mention a couple in the interest of time. So he's one of the founding board members of ELIS, the European AI organization, which has done a remarkable job, I think, in a relatively short period of time in establishing something like an AI equivalent of EMBO. And, this has really had a huge influence on the visibility of top-level AI research in Europe. He's on the advisory board of the NeurIPS Foundation, and his many, many awards include the ICML Test of Time Award. Yeah, it's a tremendous pleasure to have you, Max. A couple of organizational things. Please do feel free to post questions in the chat ahead of Q&A at the end. So if you want to sort of put a text question in, that's absolutely fine. I'll be able to see it. And yeah, it's great to have you. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. We're really looking forward to your talk and to learning more about equivariant GNNs.
Thank you, Sek, for a very nice introduction. I'm super happy to be here and talk about this topic. Of course, I'm incredibly excited about this since I recently joined Microsoft Research, who's going to start a new research lab in Amsterdam on the topic of molecular simulation. So it's true, I'm going full circle or almost full circle from quantum gravity to, well, slightly higher energies, but sort of molecules. So today I'll be talking about sort of what could be the most important interface between the field of chemistry and biology and biochemistry and machine learning. And I've sort of seen this unfold, which is these graph neural networks. They are gaining a lot of momentum in the field, and especially in the field on the where science meets machine learning, which I'm very excited about myself. Somehow it's not so easy to progress my slides. There we go.
Yeah.
So these are the people I've worked with for this particular sort of, or had an impact on the work that I'll be showing. Maybe to highlight a few things on the right-hand side. So of course there is Taco Cohen, who's been instrumental in developing the whole theory of equivariant neural networks. And there is his thesis. It's become somewhat of a Bible, but you can download it and read it. It's quite mathematical, but it really lays the foundation for the field. Another really, very extensive piece of work is from Maurice Weiler, and a PhD student right now in AmLab, and that's very beautifully illustrated. So it's highly accessible, but it turns more mathematical later on. And also very nice to read that if you want to sort of start in this field. And finally, and I will highlight this a bit more with Mark Finzi yeah, so we did this paper, and Andrew Wilson, we did this paper on basically, it's a very nice software package to build yourself your first equivariant neural net. I don't know why I'm not advancing so easily, but okay. So the overview of this talk. So by the way, here on this side, you'll see what's happening. Somebody's writing on my slides. On the right hand side, you see one of these illustrations by Maurice Weiler, and in this case, it is an illustration around an equivariant neural network on a sphere. I won't be talking about that very much, but for instance, you could imagine If you're in the sort of earth sciences and you want to study storm patterns on the earth, then that will be a very valuable tool. So I will give an introduction first on symmetry, then I'll talk a bit about equivariance. I'll introduce this graph neural network, which I believe is going to be one of the most interesting tools at the interface of sciences and machine learning. Then I'll introduce you to some models that we recently introduced as equivariant graph neural networks for studying molecules, and then I'll conclude. There's something weird with the advancing. I don't know, there's this blue, do other people see this blue thing which is on the screen? I think somebody wrote on the slide.
Yeah, and I can see that. There's a sort of, there's a blue.
Yeah, so somebody needs to remove it. Yeah, it's not me. I think other people have somehow accidentally done that.
Can anyone even do that?
Yeah, the one who put it there is probably going to be the one that also can undo it. But anyway, I'll just keep going. But it's there, and I don't know how it got there. Symmetries in the sort of physics have been a sort of unifying framework for studying sort of and sort of simplifying physics equations. So on the left-hand side here, you're seeing Maxwell. And Maxwell discovered that there is a sort of equivalence between electric fields and magnetic fields, and a observer that they're sort of connected by looking at how different observers describe electric and magnetic fields. So, for instance, if somebody is seeing an electric field, and then somebody else who is flying by at a certain speed will interpret that electric field as a magnetic field. And so that's sort of a symmetry, that where magnetic fields can be transformed into electric fields that would unify these two things into one concept, this theory of electromagnetism. And something very similar actually happened at when we were studying when Einstein was studying gravity, where so he discovered that acceleration is really equivalent to gravity. And from that, he figured basically out the whole theory of general relativity. So now, is there any way that we should try to remove this blue thing on my slides?
We've sent a message to everyone asking.
See if I can maybe remove it. Maybe 1 second to try to remove it. I also have a hard time doing anything.
You could try, perhaps let's try, someone suggests restarting screen share. Oh, it's gone now.
Okay, I just did the remove of everything. Okay, that works.
Thanks and apologies.
So I think there's also something strange with advancing the slides if people are coming into the room. Okay. So, and of course, even the entire standard model is based on basically symmetries. It's organized around symmetry. So you have the leptons and you have the quarks, and they're organized, as representations of particular groups. And this is the unitary group, the SU2 group, and the SU3 group, and so even that organizes, all of physics in the elementary particles, around group theory, which is therefore a very powerful principle. Now, what is equivariance? So at some point, we started to think about, can we also use these symmetries in machine learning? And will they perhaps also represent a powerful unifying framework there? Or at least will they be able to structure our representations that we form around the world inside our deep neural nets? Now, the idea of equivariance is not so hard to understand. So, so here I have very generally, let's say, some kind of manifold, and it has a symmetry. The symmetry is if I rotate it, over this axis here, then of course, here in this case, the signal living on that manifold, which is the gecko here, is rotated around. Now, if I want to convolve, let's say do a signal processing move on that particular manifold, I'll get something like this. This is a filtered gecko, which is living, on my manifold. And of course, I can do many layers of that before I make predictions. Then what I would like to do is if I first do my symmetry transformation and then do my convolution or my signal processing, it should be the same as first doing the signal processing and then actually doing the symmetry transformation. So if this particular diagram closes, we say that the filtering operation is equivariant, under that particular symmetry. And it structures, it puts a constraint on the sort of internal representations that it can build, on the signal. So what are the advantages of doing something? First of all, it's very data efficient. And the way to think about that is that the difference between an MLP, which is a completely unstructured neural network, multi-layer perceptron, and a convolutional neural network, which actually encodes for the translational symmetries that we find in the world, is huge, right? Because a filter is a 3x3 set of parameters, where an MLP layer is in principle number of pixels times number of pixels large. So the reduction in the number of parameters that you have to learn from data is really humongous, and therefore it's much more data efficient. It sort of has the property to kind of disentangle, as we will see in a minute. It will disentangle the hidden layers into a pose and to a presence. So you get sort of these capsules, which are sort of subspaces in this for the late variables, and so there's certain transformations that happen inside that subspace which encode for the pose of the object, and then the total amount of sort of energy in that particular capsule is going to predict for the presence of a particular object. Let's say it could be like an edge, the presence of an edge, for instance. And also the next layer is looking at a much more structured signal than if you would just take any sort of MLP layer. The next layer will have to make sense out of the signal that's coming from the layer below. And the fact that it is highly structured makes it much easier to detect patterns for the next layer that's coming. So we've been working on that since 2016, and also other people from Deepmind have also started to work on that around the same time. Now, to give a little bit more background of what an equivariant capsule is, so let's say I have an input image, and I'm going to analyze it with two filters. I have an eye filter and a mouth filter. And I'm now copying the eye filter and the mouth filter under 4 different orientations. And so we call the top line, we call the eyes capsule, and we call the bottom line, we call it the mouth capsule. Now, of course, if the image is straight up like this, the eye detector will fire here and here, and the mouth detector will fire here and here. And the other part of the capsule, you will see nothing. Now, if we rotate the input image, then what we will see is that, of course, we still fire on the eyes and the mouth, but now actually the filters that are firing are the rotated filters. So we've basically shifted from this part of the capsule to this part of the capsule, which means that we have rotated the image, and we have sort of cycled through, the 4 possible orientations to the right. And this is one of these diagrams that I was talking about. If I first do an analysis and I then if I first rotate and then filter, it should be the same as if I first filter and then rotate. And of course, when this particular operation going from here to here is more sophisticated in the sense that it's not just a rotation, it's actually also this cyclical permutation of this capsule space. Now, we've applied this idea of equivariances and symmetries much more broader than what I will talk about today. I'll just give you a little taste of the things that we've been doing. In particular, we've studied, can you also do deep learning on manifolds? For instance, here the Möbius strip. And there the problem is that if you take your filter and you move your filter around the Möbius strip, it comes back at you basically flipped, mirrored. Right, which is not the case in the Euclidean space. You can move it in any path and you'll get the same filter. And on a sphere, you have this funny phenomenon. If you move it along this path, or if you move it along this path, and you compare these two, again, they're rotated relative to each other. So what, the shift or the parallel transport of your filters now actually depend on the path that you took. And in order to take that into account, what you really need to do is you say, well, every particular point on the manifold can entertain its own reference frame. But I do need to understand, if I go from one point of the manifold to another point, both having their own reference frame, what should be the transformation that I need to apply in going between these two things. And once you do that, that's related to gauge in equivariance, turns out, and gauge fields in sort of the physics literature. It's very close to the principles that are underlying general relativity. Now, for those who want to start on these ideas, there is this paper that we wrote where McKenzie was the main author, the student of Andrew Wilson. And here, there's a very general way to basically compute your equivariant filters, your kernels that you need to have in order to do equivariant processing of a signal. And you have to basically supply this with the representation spaces between the layers, the bottom layer and the next layer. You have to choose what kind of representations you like, and you have to tell the algorithm, the generators of your group, how they act. And once you've done that, then you can this algorithm will just, software will just figure out everything, all the rest for you. It's a very powerful piece of software. So then the next chapter is graph neural nets, and as I said, this is what I feel is becoming the most useful tool for the sciences. And so in the first step would be to just think about an ordinary convolution as a message passing algorithm. So this is an ordinary convolution. You get sort of the underlying pixels of an image. And you have a filter that runs over it, shifts over that underlying image. You take the inner product between the filter values and the pixel values that it overlaps with. You sum everything up, and then you store the result here at the next layer. Now you can think of that as basically a bunch of features living on the pixels. They are vectors. They get multiplied each by their own weight matrix, and then you sum everything up. So you can think of that as a message passing algorithm. Now, for a normal convolution, actually, you can, because basically the pixels are always in the same locations and you always know what is up and what is right in your image, you can basically send different messages. Every neighbor can send a different message. For a graph neural net, the situation is different because there is no natural ordering of the nodes in the graph for a particular, node I, right? So I could have just turned this and this one around. I can have just dragged this one here. It will be a perfectly valid representation of my graph, but now the ordering would have been screwed up. The other thing is that the number of neighbors can actually change as well. And so the first algorithm that we came up with, and I think also around 2016 with Thomas Kipf, was to say, well, there's a very simple solution, which is to just send the same message for every neighbor. And although it was a little bit criticized perhaps as maybe too simple, it turns out that it's actually surprisingly powerful. And but I should say this idea is now being generalized already by a large number of groups to much more powerful networks. You can think of them as message passing schemes again. So there is a feature vector at node I, there's a feature vector at node J, and then there are some edge features which are constant, they're not updated. You push them through a neural net to get a message. Then you collect all the messages from I to J, and that updates the message for node J. And then to update the feature vector for node J, you take the message, you take some fixed feature vectors on that node J, you take the original age, and then you push that through another neural network to get you the next age. So that is the, a somewhat general way to write down what a graph neural network does. Now, then we became interested in modeling molecules with, graph neural nets. And then, of course, we had to combine the idea of a graph neural net with the idea of equivariance, right? Because a molecule, here you can think of this maybe as a molecule. So there is some invariant features, some properties maybe of the atoms here. And there is some vector features, for instance, a force or a velocity. right? And what we want then, according to Equivariance, is to say, well, if we do signal processing on this particular sort of input graph, then we're going to move the x values around. We're going to transform the features into other features, and we're going to transform the vectors into new vectors, right? So we change everything. Now, if you rotate, then we know we can geometrically see what should happen, right? So we've rotated x4 here all the way around, right? And then it ends up here. And if you then picture this vector here, it has rotated with it and it's sort of gone there, right? So that's just a mental rotation of the molecule with all its forces on it. And what we want is, if we take the molecule and we rotate it, and then we do our filtering operation or analysis or message passing, that should be the same as first doing the filtering operation and then doing the rotation. Again, that's the equivariance property. Now, in slightly more detail, we have a state. The state is these feature values h, positions x, and velocities v. There's fixed features ai and aij living on the node and the edge. There's a bunch of invariants that don't transform under rotations, which are the features h on the nodes, and for instance, distances like this. And then finally, we're going to do our message passing. So we compute for every pair of nodes a message that depends on hi and hj. That's exactly the same as in a graph neural net. But now we also have these distances that we're going to add. These are invariant. And we have our edge features. Now we compute an update for the velocity. We need that to be a vector, so it needs to transform like a vector. So we compute a phi, which is a function of the message, which is invariant by construction. And this phi is also invariant. And both phi and these difference vectors here are transformed like vectors. So then the sum of these things again transforms like a vector. So then v is a vector. And then we add, x goes to, then xt plus 1 is xt plus the velocity, right? We collect the messages again, like we did in a graph neural net. And then we do an update of the features h. Okay, so this is sort of one of the simplest graph neural networks that you can think of, that is both equivariant and is a graph neural network, and has this kind of property that permuting any of these indices, that has no effect on the final sort of prediction. So then here is a more complicated version of what I just described, and I think the paper is not yet out, maybe completely, but if it's out, I want to recommend to read it. I'm not going to be able to convey all the technical details here, but the idea here is that instead of just using a vector, we're going to use more sophisticated representations of the rotation group. So of course, a 3-vector is a simple representation of the rotation group. However, you can also construct more sophisticated higher order representations, which is basically the spherical harmonics. So y0 is a scalar, then y1 is a 3-vector, and then y2 is a 5-vector. And each of these transforms by, this one transforms by a 5x5 matrix, is by a 3x3 matrix, and this is just a scalar. Okay, so then, there is some mathematical development which then tells you how can you compute a message that is equivariant. And so the most general way that we could come up with was as follows. We have the features at the node I and the node j. We also have sort of the distance vectors that go into an MLP. But now the MLP is an equivariant MLP. So it will rotate nicely, if I actually rotate A. So A is something like, a spherical harmonic representation of the distance vector. And so we can take this as an input, and we can basically turn that using this MLP. You will have to look at the math in the paper. You can turn this into a message, which is a vector, that is a representation under this higher order representation of the rotation group. Yeah, and so anyway, I'll just skip the details here. The most important thing is to say that it is a more sophisticated version that has more representational power than the previous one that I showed. Here's yet another one. I probably also don't want to go into too many details, with this particular one, it's called the SE3 Transformer. Something like that is being used in AlphaFold. And the idea is that in this case, again, you have a node, you look at your neighboring nodes within a certain distance, and then as the transformer basically has a query and a key vector which you create in a particular equivariant way, you then send messages that are very similar to what you would do for a transformer. And if you rotate this whole thing, the representations also rotate nicely with it. Again, details you probably not understand here. That's okay. You can just read the paper. Okay, so now we have sort of seen there is a space of models out there that get increasingly sophisticated, that are both equivariant, and they are what we equivariant under rotations and equivariant under permutations of the nodes, right? And so in other words, if I change the ordering in which I feed the molecules into my program, then I'm guaranteed that at the output I will also get a permutation of the nodes. So we have now this sort of equivariance under two groups: the permutation groups of the nodes as well as the rotation group of the nodes. And so that's ideal for molecules, right? And so then I'm going to talk a little bit about why do we even want to understand molecules at this point, and what are the opportunities. The interesting thing I find is that literally everything in the world, except for forces, the most notably electromagnetic force and gravity, and two other sort of nuclear forces, is basically made of molecules. Or you could go deeper and talk about constituent particles, but it's basically molecules. Yet interestingly, it's very, very hard to simulate them. So you can, if you have a molecule of a reasonable size, it will take a ridiculous amount of time to even simulate milliseconds or microseconds of that molecule forward in time. And the reason is that they're intrinsically quantum mechanical, and the electrons that are in this system have to be treated quantum mechanically. And you can show that quantum mechanics is basically an NP-hard problem. So with the classical computer, this scales exponentially bad. But what's happening is that we are seeing a lot of machine learning technology, among which these graph neural networks, these equivariant graph neural networks, that are going to shortcut a lot of these expensive computations. So instead of doing sort of a dynamical simulation of a molecule, 1 femtosecond at a time, you can now do steps maybe in the order of nanoseconds or microseconds. So you can speed it up, 6 or 7 orders of magnitude, right? And now it becomes interesting. And there's many other places where these deep neural networks are inserted into the compute pipeline and speeding up the computations. And the beauty is that there's sort of a virtuous cycle. Every time you do an expensive computation, you basically generate data for the machine learning model to improve itself, right? And so over time, as you keep computing, you can start to improve all of these models, basically. And then, there's also the promise of quantum computing. It's a little hard to figure out, when things will actually become practical. There's people who think between 10 and 20 years, we might actually see complete fault tolerant quantum computation. But, what's interesting is that perhaps the first useful application of a quantum computer is simulating quantum nature. And so, that's simulating molecules might be just one of the first applications of a quantum computer, even if there's already sort of a bit of noise still involved in the quantum computation. This might already become useful. There's many possible applications of being able to simulate and understand molecules. There's of course drug discovery. Yeah, how do two molecules, two proteins bind to each other? Photovoltaics, which is solar panels, solar cells. Can we improve that? Tribology, which I didn't know what this was before, but it has to do with friction. And there's some interesting sort of number that somewhere around 15% of all the energy that we lose is basically due to friction. So figuring something out there is useful too. Catalyst design. for instance, carbon capture, or a catalyst for making the hydrogen splitting, water splitting into hydrogen more efficient. Nitrogen fixation is the process by which you make fertilizers. It also costs a huge amount of energy and therefore carbon emission to produce the fertilizers. And at some point in the future, perhaps whole cell modeling. Okay, so what are the three challenges that we really need to tackle in this field? Well, there's the accuracy of the simulation, which basically, we need to be able to do highly accurate simulations of molecules of reasonable size, and we want to transfer that, from one molecule to the next. We want to scale our simulations to much longer time differences. So right now, an MD simulation does 1 femtosecond at a time. You won't get anywhere for a large molecule. But if you would be able to use machine learning to skip over a whole bunch of these steps, then you can go much faster. And the final is scaling in space. We want to be able to develop methods which are not just for small molecules, but also very large molecules. And we probably have to think about, multi-scale modeling. Why I'm excited about this is that there seems to be a convergence of technologies right now happening. In the physics, in the sciences, we see the condensed matter physics, computational chemistry, and molecular biology are making big strides, in their own fields, and they're being helped by modeling disciplines such as computational science, like simulating things on large clusters, machine learning, where you learn models from data, and in the future, hopefully, quantum computer. And then the applications are actually super exciting, which is what has drawn me into the field. We have applications in health, like drug discovery or new antibiotics that are, work against resistant bacteria. Energy storage, right? Can we build catalysts for, let's say, hydrogen from hydrogen, and sustainability, like maybe, recyclable, biodegradable plastics, or carbon capture technology even. Okay, so I'll go into a few projects in a little bit of detail now, where we have looked at. So the first one is actually probably not molecular simulation. No, so this is one application. One thing we are working on, but I'm not sharing any results at this point. But of course, molecular simulation is basically you try to simulate the laws of physics, Newtonian mechanics on molecules, right, where the derivative of x is the velocity and the derivative of the velocity is the gradient of the potential function, and you basically keep going. So here we are working on speeding that up by predicting the state of the molecule somewhat further into the future. So this is a model that's based on this equivariant GNN that I talked about, the first one, the simpler one. And here, what we look at is autoencoding. So we build an autoencoder because we have an encoder where we take a graph in, and then we sort of build an internal representation. And at the same time, we want to have a decoder which takes this representation and sort of predicts a particular graph. And so that way, that will be the first step, for instance, to start generating molecules, right, with certain properties. You could sort of encode certain properties in your latent space, and then you start generating or synthesizing, molecules in silico, which you can then test. There's a very interesting problem, which is that if you just give this as an input, then in fact it's completely symmetric, so it wouldn't be able to distinguish any one of those four sort of nodes from each other. So in the latent space, they will map to the same point. So it's not very useful. So what we have to do is we have to add a little bit of noise here at the input to make this work. And basically what we have used here for the encoder, we've basically used our eGNN, which I've written out here again. And then for the decoder, we basically said, well, look at some kind of distance function between two latent vectors. And if they're aligned, basically you create an edge for that graph. And if they're not aligned, you don't create an edge for that graph. And then we train that on molecules. So the next topic has to do with sort of flow-based models. So I'll just explain a little bit about flow-based models. So in a flow-based model, again, we're trying to synthesize. So now we have an input X, and we have a neural network that preserves, that's invertible. So it preserves the dimensionality, and it's invertible to map the complicated input distribution for X into a very simple distribution that is, for instance, Gaussian, right? And that's actually not so hard because, you could just diffuse whatever the input distribution was, and you get to some kind of Gaussian. Now, the harder part is the part that sort of takes a point from this distribution and uses the inverse model to then reconstruct X again. Sort of this is a flow-based model, and so this is sort of it in action, right? So here you see you start with a Gaussian distribution at the input, and then there's these different blocks that sort of transform the points such that in the end they look like the distribution you wanted to target, which is distribution X. And you can sort of train this pipeline sort of very efficiently using deep learning techniques. And so you can use that for modeling proteins. You can train this on a neural net. And so this is a paper by Frank Noe, where you start with some distribution, simple distribution, and you're trying to basically build, generate molecules in this particular way. So here's the model that we built. This is from the University of Amsterdam, Delta Lab. So we have basically a pipeline where we start from a simple distribution that's Gaussian for all of the, the atoms. There's also a discrete distribution for the atom types. So we start with some initial set of atoms, and then we have this flow which takes any one of these atoms into a realistic atom that's coming from the distribution that we'd like to target. So in more detail, in terms of equations, if you like that. So we have a probability distribution over the space of the position space of the molecules. That's actually, there's sort of two parts to it. There's the hidden features H, as well as the sort of the positions. And now we are going to do a transformation from sort of the X to some Z space. And in order to do that transformation, we will pick up a log determinant, because that's basically the standard transformation law for densities. If you change the volume element over transformation F, going from one set of coordinates to another set of coordinates, you'll pick up the volume element, which is the log determinant. Now you can iterate that many layers, and then you basically have a normalizing flow. So we embedded that idea into an ODE, an ordinary differential equation, where you have the positions X, and you're also flowing on the sort of latent features H. Basically for the X's, we compute the derivative, which is the flow vector. We model that with our EGNN, which is written out here again. So the EGNN computes the flow vector at every time instant t, and that would then go into the ODE, who would then flow the actual X and H over that vector field, basically to their next position, and you repeat that many times. Now this has been, so we can make this equivariant, because this is equivariant, which means that the whole procedure becomes equivariant, so then we have an equivariant flow model, right? So in a flow model, and sort of a pictorially, we start with our initial positions and discrete features, which is types, etc. We have to first lift the discrete types into a continuous space, otherwise we cannot flow. So that's called dequantization. After dequantization, we do an ODE integration, which means that we take the original X and H, and we sort of we flow over the vector field phi, which is given by our EGNN graph neural network model, and then finally, it's trained to basically flow to a Gaussian distribution, and then this is the distribution for the discrete features. And we have a nice, expression we didn't derive it; others derived it. The original paper by Duveneau, where we see that there is a nice expression between the distribution X and the distribution in the latent space Z, which is given by this integral of a trace over the Jacobian, which is the continuous version of the sort of the equation I gave here. Okay, so then if you put all that together, you've trained that on a large data set, right? Then here's what you get. So you start with, okay, so that's this. Okay, let me just try to see if we can start from the beginning. So, okay, so you start from a random bunch of points generated from a Gaussian, and then the flow model in the generative direction assembles that into a nice molecule, right? And then the inference direction goes into the opposite direction, which puts it back into the original latent space. Now, so we compared, of course, this method to a whole bunch of other methods in the literature for a training set which was QM9 positional data. So here we can actually see how well can we generate sort of three-dimensional structures of molecules from the data set. And there's actually a very big gap. So it's interesting if you compare it to other methods, even equivariant methods out there. So either methods are not equivariant or the equivariant but simple. And so our method is both equivariant and has high capacity. And that actually bought us quite a bit of sort of modeling power. And if we look at the relative distances between atoms that we generated and the ones which are in the data set, we see that we also get a very nice fit. One thing that is a disadvantage still about this is quite slow. And so that's something that we need to address in the future. It doesn't scale to very large models yet. Now, the last topic, I'm not sure how much time I still have, not a huge amount of time, so I might breeze through this a little bit. So that's called, so it's called Stein. So Stein variational gradient descent is a particular model that does inference in probability distributions by having a whole lot of particles sort of equilibrate to certain positions. It's hard to kind of visualize easily, but there's a couple of terms. One term basically tells these particles to go down the energy surface, and another term tells these particles to stay away from each other so they don't fall all right on the sort of the lowest energy value. We've made this method completely equivariant. I mean, technical details is basically saying that you want, if I do this inference and I rotate the inference, I will just get the same result. So maybe better looking at the actual sort of examples here. So if we look at this example, so here's 4 Gaussian sort of blobs, and we want to sample from it. So here are the samples we get from an ordinary normal stochastic variation, a Stein variational gradient descent procedure. And if we map all these points, to one, sorry, this is the equivariant one. So if we map all these points, to one of these lobes, you see that they nicely sort of repel each other. And then if we basically take these and we sort of redistribute them over the 4 lobes, we get a very nice distribution. And the same thing is for these 2 concentric circles, they go all the place, but this particle sees this particle because of this equivariance. So they repel each other. And so you get a very nice distribution over these particles that represents the actual probability distribution. That's not the case for ordinary non-equivariant SVGD, where they don't, these 2 particles don't sort of interact with each other, and you get a much more noisy sort of set of particles to represent the nodes. And here, for instance, all these particles fall onto precisely the same point. And if you look at the sort of the accuracy with which it tries to represent the probability, is much better if you do it equivariantly. Of course, we applied this. I'm going to skip this because I think I'm running out of time a little bit. So we can train basically energy-based models, which are typical energy models that are sort of modeling the energy using a neural network. And then we applied that to, again, modeling sort of molecules. I should say I'm not sure how good these results are. It seems we can still improve a little bit on both, reproducing the histogram over distances of these molecules as well as the angles. But it looks like we were generating very reasonable molecules. Okay, so I'm nearing the end of the talk. So Microsoft Research is opening a new lab in Amsterdam to work, on this particular topic of molecular simulation with a focus on sustainability. And I'm very excited to start working on that. And then maybe let me then spend a little bit of time on conclusion. So this is me being nerdy in front of the Atlas detector at CERN. I recently visited that, and I thought it was very inspirational and interesting. What an amazing technology people have built there. And it's sort of, I thought that's actually a good analogy to the effort that we are building here in the chemistry and biology, because basically what we're building is kind of a new, if you want, instrument with which we can look deeper into matter, right? Because as we are starting to speed up these technologies, and as we make them better and better by machine learning, we can more precisely look at these molecules as they are reacting with each other, or wiggling their way, or binding, let's say, to a drug binding to a particular disease target or something like that. And in the next decade, we will see this powerful instrument sort of unfold, and hopefully chemists and biologists can start using it, for doing their research. Now, I'm excited about this because this instrument can actually lead to new and exciting breakthroughs in both chemistry and biology and material sciences, right? So, you can think about in the field of sustainability, where you can think about carbon capture or hydrogen production or clean fertilizers or biodegradable plastics. And in health, for instance, for new vaccines, antibiotics against resistant bacteria, or immunotherapy to fight cancer. And the reason why I'm optimistic that we can make big progress over the next sort of decade is that there's a number of technologies that are starting to align, to accelerate this field, which is machine learning to learn to shortcut some of these very expensive simulations with data, massive scale and cloud computing becoming available. Of course, this is where Microsoft comes in, in my sort of journey. In quantum computing, in maybe 10 to 20 years, where it might start to play a very important role to accelerate these things. And then last, the automated high throughput experimental testing that is also being accelerated by machine learning technology to find the actual things, for instance, drugs that we would like to use. All in all, I think you can sort of say dramatically maybe that we started in the, let's say, in the Stone Age, making tools out of stones, and then going to Iron Age, Bronze Age, and then Iron Age, and then later all sorts of new materials were starting to be added to that, including glass and aluminum and steel, right? And sort of, if we are really starting to understand matter and materials using this technology, we could see an age where we could basically make all sorts of materials on demand, leading to perhaps a sort of a Cambrian explosion of all sorts of new materials that we can design, using these tools. And that is my hope. And in particular, my hope is that we can make a dent in these really important challenges for humanity, such as sustainability and health. All right, that's it for today. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you very much, Max. That was really great. Thank you. So we have a hand up from Vivek Sinha. So let me just go ahead, Vivek.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I was just wondering, the EGNN transformations that you showed, if I understand correctly, you start sort of from the animations, it seems that you start with sort of a certain number and type of atoms, and then eventually the transformation leads to a certain three-dimensional molecular scaffold, which you would like to be as close to what, for example, a quantum mechanical method would predict. During these transformations, is the number of atoms going to be conserved, and how do you define like what target you are going to achieve with the input set that you start with via EGNN?
Yeah, okay, great question. So, so there is a probability distribution over the number of atoms. So you first draw the number of atoms that you're interested in, and then you keep it fixed. Once you have it determined, then you keep it fixed. Then, given that sample, you will then flow it using your model in a configuration that is, sort of a realistic sort of physical atom that could exist in the real world, right? And you could condition that perhaps on properties. You could say, I want a molecule, that binds well to this particular thing, or whatever you want to specify. You can sort of, in principle, train that into your model and draw from a conditional distribution of realistic physical molecules given the properties that you specify. Now, the way to train this is you train it on a large database of molecules that you have seen, right? So let's say you take QM9 or you take another data set of all sorts of molecules. And the task is, if you're not conditioning on anything, the task is to just generate new molecules of that kind. Maybe you have seen, the images that you can generate using GANs, right? You can generate completely new unseen faces that really look like faces. So here you can imagine that this model would generate molecules that haven't ever been synthesized, but are synthesizable, right? I'm not saying that the current model actually does that. It produces things which look realistic, but I think there's a lot of things missing too, right? I mean, there are lots of more constraints that you can add to this problem to make it actually more physically realistic. But that's something to be explored later. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
We have a question by, I'm just going to the text chat. So a question from Andres Borosi, who I'll just read out the question. And unless Andres, you wanted to sort of ask it yourself.
No, I mean, I think it's clear from the text.
Oh, no, go ahead anyway. I think it's a
I'm a chemist, and I also have some experience in computational chemistry and chemoinformatics at 25 years or so. And I just couldn't figure out from your presentation, which was really interesting, that why would be this method or model useful? This flow Gaussian. What
right.
can we do with this model better than the model what we already have?
Right. So so there's two types of models, right? So the first model goes from you input, let's say, a particular molecule with their charges and their positions and all these things, and you can train it to predict properties, right? So you can train it, let's say, how toxic is this model and how well does it bind? So I think that's clear that that's very useful. Okay. So then you're asking the question, what's useful about doing the opposite, right? So how is it useful to, okay, so let's say that we succeed. Okay, so if we succeed, then you could in principle say, okay, I want a molecule of approximately so many atoms that is, not very costly to produce, but that actually binds well, to this particular thing and is not toxic. And then you stick that into the top layer of your neural net, and it is being trained to then generate instances of molecules that are, have these properties or approximately these properties. Okay, so this might still be quite far away. You might, as a chemist, not believe that that's actually something that's realistic now, and I might agree with you. So this is just a sort of first start in this particular direction. You can also think of it slightly differently, right? So what I really want to do is search through the space of molecules effectively. And that's maybe a more realistic target, right? So you could say something like, I want to specify this particular model with these properties. And now I want to very quickly in silico go through many molecules that have that particular property. And also here you can imagine that something that synthesizes molecules could actually be quite sort of useful in that particular search process, right? So you would generate some move in your latent space where you think that these properties live, and you would generate all sorts of things. And then you would have another model that checks whether these molecules actually are, realistic and have actually these properties by then analyzing them again in the opposite direction. So you could I kind of see these two models interacting with each other to speed up this process of searching in this space of molecules faster.
Yeah, I think it's already possible if you use, for instance, fingerprints or any kind of graph-based approaches, or even 3D, that you can generate molecules in the cavity, and then you can have another model, a kind of quantitative structure activity relationship, which can check it. And this is available for more than 30 years.
Yeah.
In the field.
So basically what you're saying is that we should compare to these methods, and I totally agree. So I would basically propose to have some kind of, I would say, challenge, or some kind of a data set with a particular metric and a challenge where, the chemist would specify, okay, so this is what I want. right? This is would be very useful for me. And then we would, and here's a bunch of, methods that we use in chemistry right now to achieve that. And then you tell the machine learning people or the people who are trying to beat it with their deep learning methods to actually do better on these metrics. And I would be very, very interested in some setup like that. I think right now these models are at the stage of, actually the feed-forward models are actually already very good. So if you, for instance, if you look at something like the OC20 sort of a challenge, you see that the deep learning models do extremely well, for instance, in predicting, the relaxation energy of, let's say, some kind of absorbent, binding to a catalyst. So there already, I think we are seeing genuinely improvement using deep learning. But these generative models, you could argue, maybe not so useful. But then I think if we have these challenges like the OC20 data challenge, that we can actually make real progress.
Okay, thank you very much.
In the interest, I'd just like to take maybe a couple more questions. So, there's a nice no free lunch type question from Gilbert McKenzie. I don't know if you want to ask it in person or should I just read it out? But the question is there a downside to equivariance? I guess having the wrong one might be the max.
Yeah. So it's a good question. So, so there is a downside, which is, I think, computational. So you're spending more computation basically by doing your equivariance computations. Now you could have the wrong symmetry. It might only hold approximately, and of course that's the wrong inductive bias, and then you would constrain your model too much. But in machine learning, it's always a game between inductive bias and and data. So if you put a lot of inductive bias, then you reduce the flexibility of your model somewhat, and then you might not be able to overcome it. And in this case, also computation plays into it. Now, we have not seen so far that these models perform worse than non-equivariant models. You could say, well, maybe they don't do as, or maybe you can do something with data augmentation as well. We've seen that they also improve over data augmentation approaches. I think the major downside could be basically that you spend a little bit more computation than you would if you don't do equivariance.
Great, thank you. I guess we have time maybe for one last question. So there are several really interesting questions in the chat. So I don't think we can get to all of them, but let me just so here's one. Is there a risk of the deep networks? So from James Fern, I don't know if you wanted to ask this yourself, but is there a risk of the deep network straying too far from the training data and making up the science itself?
Right. Yeah, there's always that, right? So this has to do with domain adaptation. So if you train your data on a particular set of molecules that they have a certain size, and then you want to apply it to much bigger molecules, it's likely not to generalize to those much bigger molecules. So in machine learning, you always have to be very careful that your data set covers the domains that you're interested in. Is that what you meant, perhaps, or is there something else that you meant?
Yeah, exactly. I was wondering whether the deep network might be better at predicting a sort of generic molecule or sort of an average, rather than perhaps the more practically useful ones that could be at the tails or the edges.
Right. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem, because if you train your model well, it should sample correctly from the probability distribution. It could be that maybe the probability of those molecules is extremely low, and it will not generate it automatically. You will have to sample a lot before you see these things. But then you could argue you want to conditional things. So if you start to build models that are conditional on certain properties, you could say, okay, I want a molecule with these and these properties, and then it will sort of drive the simulation into the direction of molecules with that particular properties, and that could cover the tails.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think, with apologies to sort of others who might have wanted to ask a question, I think we should really wrap up. And I'd like to thank the speaker, and thanks, Max. This was really super interesting, and I think much food for thought for many of us. And very many thanks, and good luck with setting up the new lab, and thanks again.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It was great fun. Thanks for the good questions.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.